All aboard Proxyopoly! Proxy, and that's how it votes. Millions of proxies living as foes. Proxy, it's not too late to learn how to love and forget how to hate. Proposals not passing, it's a bit of shame. I'm going off the boards on a Proxyopoly. I'm going off the boards on a Proxyopoly. And welcome back, all you bulls and bears and betas out there, to the buzz of this Proxyopoly spin-off series we call the Proxyopoly Podcast. I'm your host, the Proxyopolist, formerly known as the Jackal of Trades. Here again with another exclusive proprietary Proxyopoly TM research report for Alphabet Inc. That's right, Proxyopolis. Following the Proxyopoly score for Deutsche Bank, BlackRock, Tesla, Walmart, ExxonMobil, Meta Platforms, Amazon, Spotify, Apple, we now have on the docket today a scathing analysis of Google's parent company, Alphabet Inc. Without any further delay, Proxyopolis, let's just dive into this episode. Brought to you by Proxyopoly TM. Proxyopoly TM is a protected trademark under the United States Patent and Trademark Office and reserves all rights protected therein. Introduction. Alphabet Inc., Google's parent company, faces its next annual general meeting amid intensifying scrutiny of its corporate governance structure and strategic direction. As one of the world's most powerful technology companies, Alphabet wields enormous influence over markets and public welfare. From the information ecosystem of Google Search and YouTube to the burgeoning field of artificial intelligence, or AI, this report evaluates Alphabet through the lens of Proxyopoly TM, a framework assessing how a single proxy vote's impact can, quote, volatilize, unquote, public interest in free markets, analogous to how beta measures volatility in financial markets. Isn't that insightful? We focus, however, on the 5 core Proxyopoly TM ratings underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly score. Each Proxyopoly TM rating examines a different facet of Alphabet's governance risk and derives an overall Proxyopoly TM score, as previously mentioned. High scores indicate a governance structure that resists shareholder intervention and accountability, potentially undermining broader market health and public trust. The 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings you will learn more about in this podcast are 1. Proxy accumulation resistance, 2. Bylaw Fortification Index, 3. Shareholder Hostility Quotient, 4. Executive Entrenchment Factor, and 5. Regulatory Evasion Measure. We critically apply each Proxyopoly TM rating to Alphabet's situation, citing recent filings, annual general meeting outcomes, recent quarterly earnings reports, and expert analyses. Finally, we provide a final Proxyopoly TM score for Alphabet and offer recommendations, including policy changes to enhance governance and voting guidance on the 10 incumbent board members: Larry Page, Sergey, Brin, Sundar Pichai, John L. Hennessy, Francis Arnold, R. Martin Chávez, L. John Doerr, Roger W. Ferguson Jr., K. Sam Shriram, and Robin L. Washington. Alphabet's current governance is defined by an insular ownership structure and board composition that many observers consider unfavorable to ordinary shareholders. The company operates a dual-class share structure that concentrates voting power in the hands of co-founders Larry Page and Sergey Brin. Although Page and Brin each own only a few percent of Alphabet's total equity, their Class B shares carry 10 votes per share, giving them majority control over shareholder votes. This structure, initially justified as providing stability and long-term vision, has come under fire for disenfranchising public investors and insulating management from normal market accountability. Indeed, institutional advisors have begun pushing back. In 2023, both Institutional Shareholder Services, ISS, and Glass Lewis urged shareholders to oust Alphabet's board chair, John Hennessy, specifically due to his support of this multi-class structure that keeps the co-founders in complete control of the company. At the same time, Alphabet is racing to transform itself in the face of new competitive and regulatory pressures. CEO Sundar Pichai has repositioned the company as an AI-first organization, recently touting robust growth driven by AI across search, YouTube, and cloud. In the latest earnings call, Pichai claimed Alphabet is, quote, leading at the frontier of AI and shipping at an incredible pace, unquote, with AI, quote, positively impacting every part of the business, unquote. Massive investments in AI are underway. For example, the company is boosting capital expenditures on data centers and AI infrastructure to meet surging demand. Yet some analysts caution that Alphabet still trails emergent players like OpenAI in certain AI arenas, a vulnerability that underscores the need for agile oversight. The juxtaposition of high technological ambition and a stagnant governance regime raises a critical question. Is Alphabet's board and ownership model equipped to responsibly steer the company through rapid innovation cycles and societal impacts of its own technology? The Proxyopoly ratings attempt to answer this by diagnosing where entrenched power dynamics may pose risks. In the following analysis, we delve into each Proxyopoly TM rating for Alphabet Inc., assigning an indicative rating and evidence-backed analysis. These Proxyopoly TM ratings feed into an overall Proxyopoly TM score presented thereafter, along with strategic recommendations for reform. All evidence is drawn from recent company disclosures, independent analysis, and the outcomes of Alphabet's 2023, 2024, and 2025 proxy seasons, ensuring the report reflects the most up-to-date information on Alphabet's governance and performance in public markets. Without further delay, Proxyopoly TM rating number 1. Proxy accumulation resistance. Proxyopoly TM assigns a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.9 for the proxy accumulation resistance. This is extremely high. Alphabet's ownership structure makes it extraordinarily resistant to any outside shareholder accumulating enough voting power to influence corporate policy. In effect, no amount of proxy votes from ordinary shareholders can override the will of the co-founders, given their built-in majority. The company's dual-class share system grants Class B shares 10 votes each, versus 1 vote for Class A shares. Founders Larry Page and Sergey Brin hold the bulk of Class B stock, thereby controlling about 51.3% of the total shareholder vote, despite owning barely 12% of the equity. This voting monopoly by insiders means that even if every other shareholder united, they could not pass a proposal or elect a director opposed by Page and Brin. One analysis flatly concludes that this structure makes it impossible for shareholders to implement change without the buy-in of the co-founders. The empirical evidence from recent annual general meetings underscores Alphabet's extreme proxy resistance. No shareholder proposal can pass without insider approval, and insiders have consistently withheld that approval. For example, in 2024, shareholders voted on a resolution to equalize voting rights. 1 share, 1 vote. By phasing out the dual-class structure. On the raw numbers, only 33.2% of shares voted in favor. A defeat. However, when isolating independent shareholders, excluding votes of management and insiders, a staggering 94.9% of non-management shares supported the proposal. In other words, virtually all outside investors wanted reform, but their collective will was thwarted by the founders' high vote stock. Similarly, a human rights related proposal in 2023 asking for a risk assessment of locating Google Cloud data centers in Saudi Arabia officially got only 17% support, yet nearly 58% of independent shareholders backed it once Larry Page's votes were excluded. These cases illustrate how Alphabet's structure dilutes even overwhelming consensus among outside investors. Insider votes single-handedly swung the outcome to defeat proposals that a majority of the public float supported. Alphabet's resistance to proxy accumulation is further demonstrated by its past maneuvers to preserve control. In 2012, the company created a third class of stock, Class C, non-voting shares, to enable stock splits and acquisitions without eroding founder voting power. This recapitalization was pushed through, quote, with little regard for the shareholders' opinion, unquote. Over 87% of Class A shareholders opposed issuing the non-voting Class C shares, but the insider super votes carried the day. The New York Times noted at the time that only 12.7% of outside Class A shareholders supported the move, yet it proceeded regardless. This episode highlights Alphabet's extreme immunity to shareholder opposition. Even when public stockholders overwhelmingly object, insiders can accumulate their own proxies and push through capital changes to entrench control. The practical effect is that activist investors or hostile acquirers have virtually no leverage at Alphabet. Traditional governance checks, like the threat of a proxy fight or tender offer, are toothless because voting control is pre-sewn up. Alphabet's share structure thus earns a proxy accumulation resistance rating at the top of the scale. By comparison, a typical one-share, one-vote company baseline Proxyopoly rating 1.0 can be swayed by a majority investor coalition. Alphabet approaches the theoretical maximum, a single shareholder dictatorship. This entrenched setup insulates management from market discipline, as evidenced by the failure of all outside-led initiatives that lack founder endorsement. In sum, Alphabet shareholders, other than the insiders, are largely disenfranchised, and any would-be governance challengers face a brick wall. The co-founders' 10-to-1 super voting shares create a permanent anti-takeover defense. Quote, impossible for shareholder proposals to be approved without the approval of a select few. As a 2023 Business and Human Rights report observed, this situation raises concerns that capital markets cannot correct or restrain Alphabet's management through normal proxy voting dynamics. potentially allowing problems to fester unchecked. Such a high Proxyopoly TM rating in this category of proxy accumulation resistance signals a significant risk factor for investors and stakeholders who rely on shareholder oversight to ensure corporate accountability. For the Bylaw Fortification Index, Proxyopoly TM assigns a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.7. Alphabet's governance documents and corporate charter contain numerous provisions that fortify management and insider control, further insulating the company from shareholder intervention. Beyond the supervoting shares discussed previously, Alphabet's board has utilized and maintained additional bylaw-level defenses that amplify the power of insiders and raise the hurdles for any corporate change. These include limitations on shareholder rights and the historical unwillingness to adopt governance best practices that could dilute insider dominance. A prime example of Alphabet's fortified governance is its persistent rejection of any changes to the dual-class capital structure. Shareholders have repeatedly proposed amendments ranging from immediate recapitalization to time-based sunset clauses on Class B supervoting shares, and all have been, quote, continually rejected, unquote, by the board and controlling shareholders. The company's 2023 proxy statement went so far as to claim that Alphabet's, quote, strong governance practices and current capital structure have provided long-term stability and exceptional returns, unquote, insisting that any change, quote, is unnecessary and not in the best interest, unquote, of the company. This management stance, cited in the proxy, exemplifies bylaw fortification rhetoric. The board explicitly defends the multi-class structure as sacrosanct, entrenching it as part of Alphabet's governance creed. By positioning the dual-class setup as beneficial and refusing to consider reform, the board has effectively codified founder control into the company's DNA. Alphabet's certificate of incorporation and bylaws also embed structural provisions that hinder shareholders from taking independent action. For instance, until very recently, Alphabet did not permit shareholders to act by written consent, a standard mechanism that allows investors to propose actions between annual meetings. A 2025 proposal to grant shareholders the right to act by written consent was decisively voted down. Only 756.5 million votes for, as opposed to the 11.73 billion votes against, reflecting management's opposition and the weight of insider votes. The failure means Alphabet's default remains that shareholders cannot initiate corporate action outside the annual general meeting without board cooperation, a limiting factor enshrined in the bylaws. Additionally, Alphabet's rules around calling special meetings are highly restrictive. If allowed at all for Class A holders, it does not have cumulative voting for directors. All typical for dual-class tech companies, but nonetheless part of the fortress of provisions shielding control at Alphabet Inc. Another layer of bylaw fortification is Alphabet's past willingness to issue non-voting shares, Class C shares, and other instruments to maintain control. The Class C stock creation in 2014, despite strong shareholder disapproval, was a charter amendment that required board initiation and approval. Insiders leveraged their votes to amend the charter and introduce a new class of stock solely to prevent dilution of their voting power. That the board felt empowered to override a majority of outside shareholders in amending fundamental rights, whereas each Class C share carries 0 votes, shows how robust the fortifications are. It demonstrated that Alphabet's bylaws and charter can be changed to management's benefit even over pronounced shareholder objection as long as the insiders agree. In practical terms, Alphabet's governance structure is self-reinforcing. The insiders can amend rules to further entrench themselves, and outside shareholders lack the tools to stop it. It is also notable that external governance watchdogs rate Alphabet poorly on governance structure. Institutional Shareholder Services, or ISS, for example, assigns Alphabet the highest risk score, 10 out of 10, on governance quality in its evaluations, in large part due to its multi-class share structure and associated lack of shareholder rights. This is a clear signal that, by objective criteria, Alphabet's bylaws and charter arrangements are considered alarmingly anti-shareholder. Features contributing to this include the absence of an independent board chair empowered by shareholder vote. The chair is appointed by the board and currently is a long-tenured director aligned with the founders. Supermajority vote requirements for certain actions, common in charters to prevent changes without insider consent, and the aforementioned limits on special meetings and proxy access. In sum, Alphabet's Bylaw Fortification Index is high. The company's foundational documents and governance policies are heavily tilted toward the preserving of insider control and limiting the avenues for shareholder influence. From the continued embrace of dual-class stock to the prior creation of non-voting shares over investor protest, to denying shareholders basic rights like acting by written consent, Alphabet's leadership has erected a resilience governance fortress. This fortification contributes to Alphabet's overall Proxyopoly TM risk profile by ensuring that even beyond raw voting power, the rules of the game are stacked in management's favor. Shareholders operate within a tightly constrained field where initiating change is procedurally difficult or outright impossible without board approval. The result is a governance regime where the only realistic path to change is voluntary board action or insider acquiescence, which history shows is rarely forthcoming. Next, we have Proxyopoly TM rating number 3, Shareholder Hostility Quotient, for which Proxyopoly TM has assigned a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.8 for Alphabet Inc. Alphabet's relationship with its non-insider shareholders can be characterized as largely unresponsive and at times openly dismissive. As evidenced by the consistent defeat of shareholder proposals and the board's oppositional stance on virtually all investor-driven governance or policy initiatives, the shareholder hostility quotient measures how management treats outside shareholder concerns. And at Alphabet, the pattern has been one of systemically voting down and ignoring such inputs. The annual meeting results from recent years paint a stark picture. In 2023 and 2024 and 2025 proxy seasons, every single shareholder proposal on Alphabet's ballot was rejected, despite many addressing significant issues and receiving considerable support from independent stockholders. At the 2025 annual general meeting held on June 6, 2025, shareholders put forth 13 separate proposals covering topics from corporate governance reforms to AI ethics to environmental practices to digital child safety. The outcome: all 13 proposals were resoundingly defeated, aligning with the board's recommendations to vote against on each one. For example, a proposal to tie executive pay to performance metrics garnered a mere 165 million votes for versus 12.33 billion votes against. Even proposals on transparency, including disclosing charitable contributions, or proposals on climate action, were overwhelmingly voted down. In one case, 48.5 million votes for were cast versus 12.43 billion against on one social proposal. In another example, approximately 1 billion votes were cast for versus 11 billion votes cast against on a climate measure. The sheer scale of these defeats, often over 90% of the total votes cast against, reflects the voting power imbalance but also the board's uniform opposition to each resolution. Alphabet's board explicitly recommended voting against every single shareholder proposal in 2023, 2024, and 2025, signaling a blanket resistance to outside input. Proxy advisory firm Glass Lewis noted that Alphabet's board had taken a, quote, management knows best, unquote, approach by opposing 13 of the 13 stockholder resolutions in 2023. This consistent opposition, combined with the guaranteed defeat via dual-class votes, creates an atmosphere of shareholder disenfranchisement and hostility. Essentially, no matter the issue, be it human rights, lobbying transparency, AI oversight, or even adopting one share, one vote, the board stance has been unyielding no. In 2023, proposals calling for increased lobbying disclosure and assessing human rights impact of data center locations were backed by Institutional Shareholder Services, ISS, and Glass Lewis, yet management still prevailed in blocking them. Alphabet even declined to respond to inquiries from investor advocacy groups about these issues. Unlike some peers, a Business and Human Rights Resource Center survey noted that Alphabet was the only big tech firm that did not reply to requests for comment on shareholder proposals about human rights in 2023. This lack of engagement underscores a certain dismissiveness towards shareholder dialogue. Critically, the hostility isn't because shareholders don't dare or aren't raising issues, it's that their concerns are systemically disregarded. Many proposals at Alphabet actually win strong support from Class A public shareholders only to be drowned out by insider votes. A telling case is the equal voting rights proposal. As mentioned, an estimated 94.9% of the independent shareholders supported it, indicating near unanimity among outside investors that the dual-class structure is problematic. Yet the official tally showed only 33% in favor, because the insiders unilaterally struck it down. Similarly, multiple 2023 proposals related to human rights and AI garnered 40 to 50% overall support among independent shares, a strong signal of concern, but 0% chance of passage overall. The board's unwillingness to even acknowledge these majority outside votes, for instance, by committing to consider the issue despite technical defeat, speaks to a hostile posture. Instead, Alphabet's leadership has publicly stated that its current governance is sufficient and beneficial, brushing off shareholder critics as misguided. This dynamic has led to rising frustration among institutional investors. In the 2023 director elections, we saw a hint of protest. Over 40% of independent Class A shareholders withheld support from Chairman John Hennessy's re-election, reflecting dissatisfaction with his handling of governance issues. Overall, Hennessy was re-elected easily due to Class B votes, but the large withhold from the public side was symbolic. Some major asset managers have also started breaking from management on key votes. BlackRock and Vanguard, for instance, have in recent years voted for shareholder proposals to abolish dual-class structures at Alphabet, contrary to the board's recommendation. That said, these acts of dissent remain largely symbolic under the current structure. All incumbent directors, including CEO Sundar Pichai and the co-founders, were re-elected in 2025 with over 95% total votes in favor, an unsurprising outcome given insiders control the vote counting. For instance, Larry Page received 10.12 billion votes for versus 2.38 billion votes against. Those 2.38 billion votes against likely represent a large portion of Class A float, but they are not enough to seriously challenge him. The bottom line is that shareholder disapproval has no teeth at Alphabet under current conditions. Alphabet's shareholder hostility quotient is thus very high. The company exhibits a pattern of actively stonewalling shareholder input. The governance system not only enables this through voting power disparity, but the board's chosen approach exacerbates it, meeting reasonable shareholder requests with resistance rather than compromise or dialogue. From a Proxyopoly TM perspective, this hostility means the normal corrective mechanisms via shareholder democracy are broken. Important issues, such as ethical AI use, climate action, political spending disclosures, etc., that shareholders raise are persistently ignored, potentially allowing risks to accumulate unaddressed. Such misalignment between management and shareholder interests can have broader repercussions. It undermines investor confidence in the fairness of the market and, in Alphabet's case, may allow societal harms or business risks to continue without mitigating influence of shareholder oversight. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 4. The executive entrenchment factor, or as we like to call it, ETH! For the executive entrenchment factor, Proxyopoly TM has assigned a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.9 for Alphabet Inc. Alphabet's leadership, both at the executive and the board level, is deeply entrenched. Owing to long-standing control by the founders, a lack of truly independent oversight, and governance practices that protect incumbents from removal, the executive entrenchment factor assesses how difficult it is for a company's top leaders to be replaced or overruled if they underperform or act against shareholder interests. For Alphabet, multiple indicators show an entrenched regime, co-founders who maintain power without formal management roles, a board stacked with loyalists and long-tenured members, as well as outsized executive compensation with minimal accountability. The most glaring sign of entrenchment is that Larry Page and Sergey Brin effectively remain the ultimate authority at Alphabet. Despite stepping down from day-to-day management in 2019, Page and Brin relinquished their CEO and president titles at that time, appointing Sundar Pichai as CEO of both Google and Alphabet. However, they retained their board seats and, critically, their majority voting control of the stock. To this day, both are employees and controlling shareholders of Alphabet, and they continue to wield veto power over any strategic or governance decision via their voting shares. This means that even without holding executive office, the founders are entrenched as de facto ultimate decision makers. They answer to no one but themselves. Shareholders cannot remove them due to voting control, and the board, which they sit on, has shown no inclination to challenge them. This situation is virtually the textbook definition of entrenchment born of dual-class stock. Insiders who can step back from responsibilities yet still block any unwanted change in leadership or direction. Their continued presence and control make it highly unlikely that Alphabet would ever, for example, install an independent board chair or bring in an outside CEO against the founders' wishes. Alphabet's board composition further contributes to this entrenchment. Several directors have extraordinarily long tenures and close ties to the founders, raising questions about their independence. Notably, K. Ram Shriram and L. John Doerr have been on the board since Google's earliest days, circa 1998 to 1999. Shriram was one of Google's first angel investors and a mentor to Page and Brin. And Doerr's venture capital firm funded Google and has benefited immensely from its rise. With over 2 decades each on the board, these directors are part of the inner circle and have consistently supported management's positions. Such longevity impairs their objectivity. Governance experts often warn that any director serving longer than 10 years may become too aligned with management. Likewise, John L. Hennessy, the board's current chair, joined the board in 2004 and has been in the role of chair since 2018. Hennessy has a renowned computer scientist background and a former Stanford University president, but his long association with Google's leadership and his open defense of the dual-class structure, their very mechanism of entrenchment at Alphabet, indicate he is not inclined to rock the boat. In fact, proxy advisory firms, Institutional Shareholder Services, and Glass Lewis cited Hennessy's, quote, continued support of the multiple class share structure, unquote, as a key reason they recommended voting against his re-election in 2023. Essentially deeming him as an impediment to better governance. When outside analysts call for the ouster of the board chair to effect change, it is the sign of how entrenched the status quo is. Beyond the founders and these long-tenured allies, even Alphabet's newer independent directors face structural limitation in exerting influence. The board does have some recently added members, for example, former finance executive Robin Washington, Nobel laureate Dr. Francis Arnold, and former banking executive Marty Chávez, all joining within the last 5 years. These individuals bring valuable expertise and diversity. However, given the voting control dynamics and the leadership of the board by entrenched insiders, it's unclear how much power they truly have to challenge or override decisions. The board remains under the shadow of the co-founders. For example, there is no indication that the board seriously pressured the founders to relinquish their super voting shares or that it questioned management strategies during times of misstep. One potential misstep was Alphabet's initially sluggish response to the rise of OpenAI's ChatGPT, a 2022 event that caught Google off guard by many accounts. Some investors attributed this to a complacent culture under longtime leadership. Indeed, frustration with CEO Sundar Pichai's performance surfaced in shareholder forums. There were calls from certain quarters to vote out Pichai for being overpaid and allegedly, quote, blindsided by a small startup, unquote, in artificial intelligence. While these are opinions, they highlight a concern that entrenched management may have been slow to innovate, nearly jeopardizing Google's dominance in search when new AI competitors emerged. The board's role is to hold management accountable for such strategic lapses, yet Pichai remains secure in his position, receiving strong board support and hefty compensation packages. On that note, executive compensation at Alphabet reflects another facet of entrenchment. Sundar Pichai's pay, for example, was roughly $210 million in 2022, mostly from equity grants. Institutional Shareholder Services, ISS, took issue with this pay package as a proxy advisor, flagging it as excessive relative to performance and recommending shareholders vote against it. Despite such objections, Alphabet's insider-controlled vote meant Pichai's pay faced no real check. A 2023 shareholder proposal to better link executive pay to performance was overwhelmingly defeated with only 1% of votes cast in favor. The ability of management to award lavish compensation, such as Pichai's pay being among the highest for any CEO, without serious shareholder pushback, is a hallmark of an entrenched executive team. It suggests the board's compensation committee, led by members selected by the same insiders, is not pushing back on pay, and shareholders lack power to intervene through say-on-pay votes when insiders vote those down too. Entrenched executives often enjoy outsized pay and perks because normal accountability mechanisms, shareholder votes, or threat of removal are absent. Alphabet fits this pattern. In summary, Alphabet scores at the top of the chart on the executive entrenchment factor as a Proxyopoly TM rating. Key reasons include founder control that outlives their executive roles, a cadre of long-serving board members loyal to the founders, little turnover or refreshment at the top, and shareholder inability to effectively challenge leadership decisions or pay. The overall governance design virtually guarantees continuity of the current regime unless the insiders themselves decide to make changes. While stability can have benefits, the downside of such entrenchment is a potential lack of accountability and adaptability. In Alphabet's case, with technology evolving at breakneck speed, artificial intelligence being a prime example, and public scrutiny growing, an entrenched leadership could either miss critical shifts or resist necessary reforms. The company's dominance in its core markets adds a public interest angle. When leadership is entrenched, issues like antitrust concerns, privacy practices, or platform abuses might not be adequately addressed, since external pressure through investor action is ineffective. This underscores how a high executive entrenchment factor, or EEF, can impact not just shareholders, but customers, competitors, and society. Moving on to the final Proxyopoly TM rating, number 5, regulatory evasion measure, for which Proxyopoly TM assigns a Proxyopoly TM rating of 1.96 positively. To Alphabet Inc. Alphabet has a track record of aggressively pushing boundaries of regulations and engaging in extensive lobbying and legal maneuvers to evade or shape regulatory oversight. This measure evaluates how the company interacts with regulators and laws, whether it leans towards transparency or compliance or towards avoidance and circumvention. Alphabet falls on the latter end of the spectrum. It expends vast resources to influence legislation. It has been penalized multiple times by regulators for violating laws, and it often resists or delays compliance through appeals and lobbying. One clear indicator is Alphabet's massive lobbying expenditure and political influence network. The company is routinely among top corporate lobbyists in the United States, spending on average $15 to $20 million per year on federal lobbying in recent years. In total, Alphabet spent $119 million on federal lobbying from 2015 to 2022, an enormous sum. And this figure excludes state-level lobbying, where Google has lobbied in at least 39 U.S. states in a single year in 2022. Internationally, it spends heavily as well. Over 5.5 million euros on lobbying in the European Union in 2022. These expenditures are aimed at influencing policies on antitrust, privacy, taxation, artificial intelligence regulation, and more. What is telling is that Alphabet has been accused of, quote, shady lobbying, unquote, tactics and funding a web of front groups to advance its agenda. Investigations show Alphabet supports over 360 trade associations, think tanks, and advocacy organizations, some of which engage in, quote, dark money, unquote, lobbying. Political spending by groups that don't disclose their donors. For instance, Alphabet has funneled money into groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable, which have opposed antitrust and labor regulations, as well as nonprofits like the Competitive Enterprise Institute that deny climate change and fight tech regulations. It was reported that Alphabet secretly funded organizations to specifically oppose antitrust reforms targeting big tech. This pattern suggests a concerted strategy to evade regulation by proxy, using lobbying and third-party groups to prevent stricter laws that might curb Alphabet's market power or data practices. Alphabet's stance toward compliance can be gauged by its legal record. The company has faced multiple antitrust lawsuits and enforcement actions in jurisdictions around the world, often being found in violation and then working to overturn or mitigate the consequences. In the European Union, Alphabet via Google has been fined billions of euros for anti-competitive practices, including a record 4.34 billion euros fined in 2018 for abusing the dominance of Android, and earlier a 2.42 billion euro fine in 2017 for manipulating search results in the Google shopping case. While these specific instances are outside U.S. jurisdiction, they demonstrate a willingness to push competitive limits. In the United States, Alphabet is now the subject of a landmark antitrust case. In 2023 of October, a federal trial concluded on the Department of Justice lawsuit alleging Google monopoly in online search. Separately, in late 2024, a U.S. district court ruled that Alphabet violated antitrust law in the digital advertising market, the first such major antitrust ruling against a U.S. tech firm in decades. Alphabet's response has been to appeal and fight these rulings in court, rather than acquiesce or settle in a way that reforms its practices. This is a common pattern. When faced with regulatory enforcement, Alphabet often opts for protracted legal battles, effectively delaying any required changes for years. Such behavior, while within its legal right, is indicative of a strategy to delay and avoid regulatory impact as much as possible rather than proactively adapt. Moreover, Alphabet's approach to new regulatory proposals, be it privacy laws, content moderation rules, or artificial intelligence governance, tends to be defensive. The company's lobbying disclosures revealed that it has lobbied against various bills that would increase transparency or liability. For example, Alphabet, through Google, opposed portions of the Inflation Reduction Act related to climate via the Business Roundtable, even while publicly stating support for climate action, and it has quietly resisted antitrust bills aimed at big tech, funding campaigns arguing such laws would harm consumers. This disconnect between public posture and behind-the-scenes lobbying suggests a form of regulatory evasion, projecting a cooperative image but funding opposition to substantive rules. In the artificial intelligence domain, as regulators begin contemplating rules for AI safety and data usage, Alphabet has ramped up lobbying in that area as well. A recent Time report noted that, quote, a lobbying frenzy, unquote, in AI, with Alphabet among the companies spending over $10 million in 2023 to shape AI policy, given that artificial intelligence is poised to be a heavily regulated field due to societal risks. Alphabet's heavy lobbying could be seen either as responsible involvement or as an attempt to preempt strict regulation by steering the conversation, for example, favoring industry self-regulation over new laws. The regulatory evasion measure also reflects how transparent and accountable the company is regarding these activities. In Alphabet's case, shareholders have pointed out gaps in disclosure that exacerbate concerns. The 2024 shareholder proposal on lobbying transparency argued that, quote, full disclosure of Alphabet's lobbying activities and expenditures is needed, unquote, because currently Alphabet does not report how much it spends via third-party groups, nor how those activities align or conflict with the company's stated values. The proposal noted that Alphabet's lack of transparency, quote, presents reputational risks when its lobbying contradicts company public positions or hides payments to shell organizations, unquote. For example, while Google says it supports digital safety and responsible AI, it was funding trade associations and think tanks that fought regulation in those arenas. The board opposed this lobbying disclosure proposal, and unsurprisingly, it did not pass, preserving Alphabet's ability to continue influencing policy largely out of public view. In conclusion, Alphabet's regulatory evasion measure is high. The company vigorously resists regulatory constraints through extensive lobbying, strategic use of third-party advocates, and legal challenges to enforcement. It has shown a propensity to operate at the edge of what regulations allow, and when caught overstepping, to either quietly pay fines, when they are manageable, or fight findings tooth and nail if they threaten core business models. For investors and the public, this poses a double-edged sword. On one hand, it suggests Alphabet will go to great lengths to protect its business, which can preserve profits. On the other hand, it means the usual checks from regulatory bodies may take a long time to actually rein in problematic conduct, potentially enabling negative externalities, such as monopoly power, privacy incursions, misinformation on platforms, etc., to persist. A high score here indicates that Alphabet's governance and culture emphasize winning regulatory battles over cooperating or self-correcting, which can amplify risk if public sentiment or political winds turn sharply against big tech's perceived evasions. And now, having laid on the table all of the Proxyopoly TM ratings underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score, we arrive at the final Proxyopoly TM score for Alphabet Inc. Bringing together the 5 dimensions of Proxyopoly TM ratings, Alphabet Inc.'s overall Proxyopoly TM score is assessed to be one of the highest among large-cap companies, reflecting an exceptionally insular governance structure. On a beta-like scale, where 1.0 represents a typical public company's governance impact volatility, and higher values indicate greater distortion of market accountability, Alphabet's final Proxyopoly TM score is 1.8. That's right, Proxyopolis. The final Proxyopoly score for Alphabet Inc. is 1.8. This composite score signifies that Alphabet's governance structure amplifies the volatility impact of a single proxy vote nearly 80% above the market norm, meaning that shareholder votes at Alphabet, especially those cast by insiders versus public holders, can have outsized and unpredictable effects on outcomes relative to normal companies, effectively rendering ordinary votes far less influential and insider votes overwhelmingly indecisive. In plainer terms, Alphabet exhibits a high-risk governance profile under the Proxyopoly TM model. Nearly all levers of power are controlled by a few individuals, and standard shareholder oversight mechanisms are largely nullified. This Proxyopoly TM score emerges from consistently high ratings across all 5 Proxyopoly TM metrics. The proxy accumulation resistance, where Alphabet scored extremely high given the near impossibility of outside shareholders ever aggregating enough votes to challenge insider control. The Bylaw Fortification Index, where Alphabet also scored high here as its charter and policies entrench management, for example, dual-class stock, no shareholder action by consent, etc., and the board has shown no willingness to dilute these fortifications. The shareholder hostility quotient, where Alphabet's score was also very high, reflecting a management that routinely thwarts shareholder initiatives and engages minimally with investor concerns, for example, rejecting all 13 proposals in 2025 regardless of merit. The executive entrenchment factor, or EVE, again extremely high given the founder-controlled post-tenure, a board loaded with long-tenured loyalists, and the difficulty of effecting leadership change or even influencing pay without insider agreement. And finally, regulatory evasion measure, which was also rated high as Alphabet shows a propensity to circumvent or delay regulation through heavy lobbying and legal resistance rather than adapting transparently. The strong alignment of these factors yields a composite picture of a company that is largely unaccountable to its ordinary shareholders and partly unaccountable even to legal regulators. Alphabet's governance model has provided stability and continuity. Indeed, the company argues it has delivered, quote, exceptional returns, unquote, under this model. But it also poses significant environmental, social, and governance risks. An unaccountable governance system can be slower to address ethical issues in AI, for example, or to correct cultural problems such as the worker treatment and antitrust concerns that Alphabet has faced. It can also lead to strategic myopia or complacency as the normal feedback loops from investors and the market are weakened. The Proxyopoly TM score encapsulates these concerns by quantifying Alphabet's deviation from a balanced shareholder governance equilibrium. For context, Alphabet's Proxyopoly TM score is comparable to that of other founder-controlled tech giants like Meta Platforms, which also sports dual-class shares and has faced shareholder ire. Namely, Mark Zuckerberg's control is even greater at approximately 61% of votes of Meta Platforms. Both Alphabet and Meta reside in the high-risk zones of this governance spectrum. Most S&P 500 companies, by contrast, have scores closer to 1.0 or even below. Many have eliminated dual-class structures or never had them, hold annual elections, one share, one vote, and are more responsive to shareholder input. Alphabet's position at 1.08 as a Proxyopoly TM score signifies it is an outlier among mega-cap firms in terms of entrenchment and resistance to shareholder-driven change. It's important to note that a high Proxyopoly TM score does not necessarily equate to poor financial performance in this short term. Alphabet's share price and earnings have remained strong. Q2 2025 saw revenues surge to $96.4 billion with, quote, AI-fueled, unquote, growth. However, it does indicate a governance fragility. If and when problems arise, external stakeholders, shareholders, regulators, even employees to some extent, have limited ability to enforce course corrections. This could impact the public health of free markets. As the Proxyopoly TM concept frames it, because one of the world's most influential companies operates with scant democratic oversight relative to its impact. For investors, the score signals heightened governance risks that could translate into volatility or value erosion in scenarios where trust and management is shaken and where regulatory penalties materialize unexpectedly. Since traditional warning signs via shareholder votes are suppressed. In concluding this analysis, Alphabet's board and leadership should take the high Proxyopoly TM score as a call to action for governance reform. The next section outlines specific recommendations that would help reduce these risks, potentially lowering the Proxyopoly TM score over the time for Alphabet Inc., by making Alphabet more accountable and better aligned with shareholder and stakeholder interests without compromising its ability to innovate and grow. This concludes the first part of this 3-part episode, and we're going to take a quick break for all of the Proxyopolists at home to do whatever it is they do. And once again, this is a part of the podcast where we take an intermission, and I could plug in some sponsored content. I could plug in some contributed content. However, I'm just a jackal of trades in this humble Proxyopoly. If you want to contribute or sponsor anything on this podcast with the time that we have here, feel free to contact Proxyopoly TM today at linktree/NASCARCOSA. That's L as in linktree/NASCARCOSA. I as in I can find it on linktree/NASCARCOSA. N as in anywhere you can find it? No, just on linktree/NASCARCOSA. K as in K, I found it, linktree/NASCARCOSA. T as in try again looking on linktree/NASCARCOSA. R as in resolved. I found the Linktree at linktree/NASCARCOSA. Spot. E as in Eve? I want to learn more about that. Perhaps I can find it on linktree/NASCARCOSA. Another E, because Eve has got 2 E's also. Linktree/NASCARCOSA. Slash. N as in, never mind, I found everything I was looking for on Linktree/NASCARCOSA. A as in A. That's what it is. Linktree/NASCARCOSA. S as in surprise. It's Linktree/NASCARCOSA. C as in come on, feel the noise. Proxies, rock your proxies. We'll get wild, wild, wild. A Linktree/NASCARCOSA. Wild, wild, wild. A as in another A. Linktree/NASCARCOSA. R as in resolving this again, haven't we already? Linktree/NASCARCOSA. C as in I'm coming to feel the noise again at Linktree/NASCARCOSA. O as in oh my, Linktree/NASCARCOSA. S as in someone stop me, because I'm going to keep going and using all of the AI power mechanisms until somebody puts a stop to this ethically. Will they do it when they realize I can stop every board in the S&P 500? Who knows? But I'm going to do it on Linktree/NASCARCOSA. A as in again, another A. Linktree/NASCARCOSA. And again, that is the link tree you should click on if you would like to contribute sponsored content or contributed content. And you may even use this link to find out more about Proxyopoly TM. Once again, Proxyopoly TM is a registered trademark protected by the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Now back to your regularly scheduled Proxyopoly TM programming. And now we begin part 2 of this Proxyopoly TM episode. The governance and policy change recommendations for Alphabet Inc. To address the issues highlighted by the Proxyopoly TM analysis for the Proxyopoly TM score, Alphabet should consider a series of governance reforms and policy changes. These steps would improve accountability, align the company with global best practices, and potentially reassure both investors and regulators that Alphabet is committed to long-term sustainable value creation within the bounds of societal expectations. Key recommendations for governance and policy changes are as follows. Recommendation 1. Phase out the dual-class share structure. Initiating a plan to transition to a one-share, one-vote capital structure over time. For instance, Alphabet's board could endorse a multi-year sunset of the Class B super voting shares as advocated by institutional investors and proxy advisors like Institutional Shareholder Service and Glass Lewis. This would gradually empower public shareholders and reduce the proxy accumulation resistance. Even a 7-year sunset or a commitment that no new super voting shares will be issued and that existing ones will convert upon transfer, which would be positive. Such a plan would directly respond to the 94% of independent shareholders who have voiced support for equal voting rights. Recommendation for governance and policy changes number 2, appoint an independent board chair and refresh directors. Separating the roles of CEO and chair formally, if not already. Currently, John Hennessy is non-executive chair, but his independence is in doubt due to tenure. Alphabet should seek a truly independent new chair, someone with no long-standing ties to management, to lead the board and act as a counterbalance. In addition, implement a board refreshment plan. Set terms and retirement ages that would see long-tenured directors with over 20-plus years on the board like Mr. Doerr or Mr. Shriram retire in the near future, replacing them with independent directors who have expertise in areas critical to Alphabet's future, for example, AI ethics, public policy, consumer trust, etc. Increasing board diversity in terms of background and perspective will improve oversight. These moves would lower the executive entrenchment factor by ensuring the board can objectively evaluate management. Notably, proxy advisors have already called for Hennessy's removal over governance concerns. Proactively addressing this would be well received by investors. Recommendation for governance and policy change number 3. Enhance shareholder rights with bylaw reforms. Amending Alphabet's governing documents to grant shareholders more voice in between AGMs. This includes allowing shareholders above a reasonable threshold to call special meetings and permitting action by written consent. The fact that 756 million votes were cast in favor of written consent in 2025 despite management opposition indicates a segment of shareholders desire this right. By voluntarily adopting it, Alphabet would demonstrate openness to shareholder input. Additionally, implementing a majority vote standard for director elections, if not already in place, to ensure directors who lack majority support from Class A shares are re-evaluated. These changes would chip away at the bylaw fortification that currently tilts this field against shareholders. Recommendation for governance and policy change number 4. Improve transparency and align lobbying with values. As per the defeated 2024 proposal, provide robust disclosure of lobbying and political expenditures. Alphabet should publish an annual report detailing its lobbying spend, direct and through trade associations, the policy issues lobbied on, and how those efforts align with the company's publicly stated values on climate, AI responsibility, etc. Furthermore, the board should set guidelines to ensure no company funds indirectly support organizations whose agendas contradict Alphabet's commitments. For example, climate denial groups or anti-regulation fronts. Enhancing transparency here will reduce reputational risk and the regulatory evasion measure, demonstrating that Alphabet isn't, quote, gaming the system, unquote, behind closed doors. Recommendation for governance and policy reform number 5. Establish a board committee for ethical technology and artificial intelligence. Given Alphabet's pivot to artificial intelligence and the attendant controversies, data privacy, AI bias, misuse of AI, etc., forming a dedicated ethics and technology oversight committee at the board level would be prudent. This committee would oversee risks related to AI and other emerging tech, ensure internal controls and principles are followed, and report to shareholders on how Alphabet is mitigating societal risks of its products. Shareholders have repeatedly brought AI and human rights concerns to the annual general meeting with proposals on AI oversight, discriminatory impacts, etc., each getting significant outside support. A formal committee would institutionalize the board's attention to these issues and perhaps preempt some shareholder proposals by proactively addressing concerns. It signals that the board is taking responsibility for the public impact of Alphabet's technology, thus improving trust. Recommendation for governance and policy changes number 6. Align executive compensation with accountability. Reforming pay practices so that they promote accountability to shareholders and long-term performance. This could include introducing a performance-based component that is linked to clearly disclosed metrics. For example, return on investment in artificial intelligence, improvements in regulatory compliance, ESG targets, etc., as one proposal suggested. Also, consider capping annual mega grants of stock to avoid perceptions of excessive pay. When Institutional Shareholder Services flagged the $210 million CEO pay as problematic, it reflected a view that pay and performance were misaligned. By addressing this, perhaps requiring shareholder approval for any pay package above a certain threshold, Alphabet can show responsiveness and reduce shareholder frustration. Recommendation for governance and policy changes number 7. Strengthen shareholder engagement. Finally, Alphabet should improve how it engages with its shareholders year-round. This means conducting more extensive investor outreach, listening to concerns from institutional investors, many of whom manage money for the public, and incorporating reasonable feedback into company policies. For instance, if 50% of outside investors support a proposal on climate disclosure or data privacy, the board should not simply note its failure and move on. Rather, it could voluntarily implement aspects of it or offer an alternative response solution. Proactive engagement can stave off the adversarial showdowns at annual general meetings and demonstrate that Alphabet's governance is evolving. Over time, such openness could justify a lower shareholder hostility quotient as trust is rebuilt. Implementing the aforementioned recommendations would begin to rebalance Alphabet's governance toward a healthier model, potentially lowering its Proxyopoly TM score in future assessments. These changes are not only in the interest of fairness to shareholders, but also in Alphabet's own interests. Companies seen as governance laggards often trade at a valuation discount due to perceived risks. Moreover, regulators and lawmakers are less likely to intervene in a heavy-handed way if a company exhibits genuine self-governance improvements. By embracing reform, Alphabet can ensure its continued success is built on a more sustainable, inclusive foundation that benefits shareholders, users, and society at large. And now we've reached part 3 of this Proxyopoly TM podcast, having ended part 2 of this episode, proceeding into part 3. We will now have another intermission to buy us some time before part 3 begins. So, Proxyopolis at home, why don't you take a moment to make yourself whatever snack that I could plug in as a sponsored content? Could be any snack you want from the kitchen. Use your imagination. Again, I don't have anything here to plug as sponsored content, so you just kind of have to imagine the commercialism with me for a moment. And then once you get done with that snack, why don't you walk over to the bathroom and wipe your ass with whatever toilet paper your favorite brand is. Again, I don't have any toilet paper to plug in as sponsored content here, so again, use your imagination or use your hand. Alternatively, you could also use your hand to click on the mouse or your smartphone to open the link tree and then open the Patreon, where you could also print off this exclusive proprietary Proxyopoly TM research report on the Patreon if you are a Patreon Pro Zero subscriber. And once you printed it off, you could also use it as toilet paper. Because again, use your imagination, Proxyopolis, because it's coming for you. The Proxyopoly score is coming for your company. If you think your company's safe, it's not. It's not safe. Your public company, the public company you probably work for, is going to have a Proxyopoly score. All in due time, my friends. All in due time. And when I get done with all the publicly traded companies, we're going to move on to private companies. Are you scared yet? Didn't think this would happen to you. Didn't think AI could do all the research and vote on every single board director that you have at your company, did you? Using all the information in the public domain. Everything on Google, everything, everywhere, all the information it's using. It's going to come and get you. Your boards of directors aren't safe. Are you on a board? Do you want to be on the podcast and be a Proxyopolis and contribute? Well, there's your opportunity. Because you can also contribute as a contributor of knowledge, your experience. If you're a Proxyopolis on one of these boards, if you want a board I've mentioned or one that I am about to mention, are you scared yet? You can also reach out just to share your knowledge if you've got something to share. Or the invitation is open, and if you want it, you can have it. If you're even on a board, if you're doing music, if you're working at the damn breakfast joint that's open 24 hours a day with the yellow sign, you can come on the podcast. All you got to do is ask and click on the link tree at linktree/NASCAR Because again, I'm just a humble Proxyopolist, formerly known as the Jackal of Trades. Signing off on this second intermission of the podcast, segueing into part 3 for your listening pleasure, with entertainment and educational purposes. And now moving on to part 3 of this Proxyopoly TM podcast, every board of directors' favorite segment of this podcast, the 2025 Annual General Meeting voting recommendations for Alphabet Inc. At the upcoming annual general meeting of Alphabet Inc., set to take place in 2026 now, shareholders will vote on the election of Alphabet's 10 directors. Following are the voting recommendations for each board member: for, against, abstain, or withhold, along the detailed rationales based on Proxyopoly TM analysis and corporate governance best practices. The first director up for election on the docket today, Larry Page. Proxyopoly TM recommendation: vote against re-election. As Alphabet's co-founder and controlling shareholder, Larry Page holds outsized power, with Sergey Brin controlling 51% or more of voting rights. While no longer having an active management role, this arrangement undermines basic accountability. Mr. Page can effectively veto any shareholder initiative and entrench management without being the day-to-day CEO. Since he stepped down as Alphabet CEO in 2019, Page's engagement with the company's operation has been minimal publicly, yet his super voting shares allow him to dominate governance decisions. This separation of power from responsibility is problematic. Additionally, Page has been a driving force behind Alphabet's resistance to shareholder rights. He was instrumental in creating the dual-class structure and non-voting Class C stock, despite 87% of outside investors opposing it. Given these concerns, shareholders should withhold support by voting against Mr. Page at the upcoming annual general meeting to signal that unchecked control by an absentee leader is unacceptable. A vote against also aligns with calls for a more independent board. It is a referendum on the dual-class structure that Mr. Page symbolizes. It is understood that he will be re-elected due to his own votes. However, a significant vote against or withholding support even from Class A shareholders would send a strong message. Next director up for re-election on the docket today, we have Sergey Brin. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote against re-election. Sergey Brin, Alphabet's other co-founder, along with Larry Page, similarly retains enormous influence via super voting shares without a management position. Brin stepped back from executive duties. He was president of Alphabet until 2019 and has kept a low public profile in company affairs since. Yet, like Page, Brin remains a board member and, through dual-class shares, an ultimate decision-maker on all shareholder matters. He and Page act as a controlling bloc. The rationale to withhold support or vote against Brin mirrors that for Page, to object to the concentration of corporate power in the hands of founders who are no longer accountable to shareholders through executive performance. Furthermore, Brin's continued board presence crowds out the possibility of adding new independent directors. His seat could be occupied by a governance-focused independent expert if he were to step aside. Voting against Brin's re-election registers shareholder disapproval of current governance imbalance and presses for renewal. Even though insiders will re-elect him, a large against vote by outside shareholders would underscore the demand for one share, one vote, and a more accountable board. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today, we have Sundar Pichai. Proxyopoly TM recommendation: vote for. Sundar Pichai is the CEO of Alphabet Inc. and Google and a member of the board since 2017. In terms of corporate governance, it is generally considered sound practice for the CEO to have a board seat, as it allows direct linkage between management and board oversight. Pichai's leadership is currently guiding Alphabet through critical transitions, for example, the AI-driven strategy shift, and he has delivered strong operational performance. Another example, the company's latest quarter shows, quote, robust growth, unquote, in artificial intelligence, search, and cloud under his stewardship. While there have been criticisms, including by some shareholders, of Pichai's oversight pay and perceptions that Google was late to the market in AI, these are issues the board needs to manage via oversight and compensation reform, rather than necessitating Pichai's removal from the board at this juncture. Removing Pichai could disrupt management continuity without solving the underlying governance issues rooted in share structure. Therefore, a vote for Pichai's directorship is warranted with the expectation that he continues to earn shareholder trust through performance and by working with an increasingly independent board. Supporting Pichai also recognizes that he has the confidence of many key institutional investors and has been responsive in part to investor concerns. For instance, he undertook cost-cutting with 12,000 layoffs in 2023 amid pressure for efficiency. Note, however, shareholders should continue to monitor Pichai's execution on artificial intelligence and willingness to engage on governance matters like reasonable pay practices. But overall, Pichai's presence on the board is appropriate and beneficial for now, so long as independent directors hold him accountable. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today, we have John L. Hennessy. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote against. John Hennessy is the chairman of Alphabet's board. Although he is technically an independent director, not part of management, he has been on the board for over 19 years, which greatly diminishes his independence in practice. Most importantly, Hennessy has been a staunch supporter of Alphabet's dual-class share structure and overall governance status quo, putting him at odds with shareholder calls for reform. In 2023, influential proxy advisory firms like Institutional Shareholder Services and Glass Lewis explicitly recommended voting against Hennessy's re-election, citing his continued support of multi-class share structure that keeps co-founders in complete control, and other governance concerns. Indeed, under Hennessy's chairmanship, the board has opposed all efforts to introduce equal voting rights or sunset the super voting shares. Furthermore, shareholders have shown dissatisfaction. A significant proportion of independent Class A investors withheld votes from Hennessy last year. Reports indicate over 40% of outside investors did so. Effectively, a protest vote. Hennessy also faces critique on board rejuvenation and diversity grounds, as he leads a board with multiple over-tenure members and, until recently, minimal diversity. By voting against or withholding support on Hennessy, shareholders align with governance best practices that long-tenured directors who impede necessary governance evolution should be held accountable. This vote is a call for new board leadership. Ideally, the board should appoint a new independent director who is more receptive to shareholder concerns. In summary, Mr. Hennessy's contributions as a technologist are respected, but as chair, he represents an era of entrenched governance that shareholders seek to move beyond. The next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today, we have Francis Arnold. Proxyopoly TM recommendation. Vote for re-election. Dr. Francis Arnold brings valuable independent perspective to Alphabet's board. A renowned scientist, Nobel Peace Prize winning chemist at that, and academic, she joined the board in 2019 as part of an effort to infuse fresh perspective, expertise, and diversity. Dr. Arnold is independent of management and the founding duo, and her relatively recent tenure means she is not implicated in the long-standing governance issues. Instead, she contributes knowledge in innovation and ethics. She has spoken about responsible science, which is particularly pertinent as Alphabet navigates AI and other advanced technologies. Her presence helps the board consider broader impacts on society and the environment, balancing the tech-centric view with ethical considerations. Additionally, having Dr. Arnold on the board adds to gender diversity. She was the first female director on Alphabet's board in many years, if not ever. There have been no red flags in her performance, attendance, committee work, likely serving on committees as governance or audit, and she is seen as an advocate for sound corporate responsibility. A vote for her re-election supports the continuation of a more heterogeneous and expert board. Dr. Arnold is the type of director shareholders should encourage. Independent, skilled in relevant domains, and not afraid to exercise oversight. Retaining her helps counterbalance entrenched interests. We expect Dr. Arnold to be a voice in favor of science-driven decision-making and perhaps more transparency around issues like artificial intelligence risks, which aligns with shareholder and stakeholder interests. The next director of the board on the docket for re-election today is Marty Chávez. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote for re-election. Mr. Chávez, who joined Alphabet's board in 2022, is a former chief financial officer and tech chief of Goldman Sachs and is openly LGBTQ+, bringing both financial acumen and diversity to the board. As a recent addition, he is unencumbered by the historical decisions that entrenched insiders. Chávez has a reputation as an innovative thinker in technology, having led Goldman's efforts in automated trading data, and can provide valuable insight into Alphabet's challenges in monetization and fintech, as well as risk management. He is independent, not part of Alphabet's management, and with no prior deep ties to the founders. His addition to the board was welcomed as part of the necessary refresh. So far, there is no indication that Chávez has done anything other than contribute positively. For example, his financial oversight skills likely bolster the Audit Committee or Finance Committee. A vote for Chávez signals support for directors who are both highly qualified and likely to uphold their fiduciary duty to shareholders without bias. Given his Wall Street background, one can expect Chávez to be keen on accountability and shareholder value, perhaps pushing back if management decisions don't make economic sense. That kind of independent skepticism is exactly what Alphabet's board needs more of. Therefore, shareholders should re-elect Chávez and encourage him to continue being an active, engaged board member who can help steer Alphabet toward better governance. Perhaps he could be a candidate for a future lead independent director role one day. Next director of the board on the docket for re-election today is L. John Doerr. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote against re-election. L. John Doerr is a venture capitalist from Kleiner Perkins who has served on Alphabet's board since 1999. Mr. Doerr was instrumental in Google's early growth, but after 24 years on the board, his independence is highly compromised. While he is not an example, his long tenure and deep financial ties to the company, his firm profited intensely from Google's success, make him a quintessential, quote, insider-outsider, unquote. Corporate governance guidelines often view any director with over 10 years of tenure skeptically, and Doerr has more than double that. Moreover, Doerr, like Shriram, has consistently sided with management. There's no evidence he has challenged the dual-class structure or other entrenching moves. In fact, as an early investor, he benefited from them. At this stage, Alphabet would benefit from board turnover in Doerr's seat to gain new perspectives. Voting against or withholding support from the re-election of L. John Doerr is a vote for board renewal. It reflects that while shareholders respect his contributions, the company needs in 2025 are different than in 1999. Additionally, Doerr's presence, he is now 72 years old, raises succession planning concerns for the board. It's better to be the transition while things are stable. By signaling that his long service should conclude, shareholders push for a more modern and independent board composition, which could in turn improve oversight of management. In summary, Mr. Doerr's extraordinary tenure and closeness to the founders warrant a vote against or withhold support of re-election to prompt refreshment and reduce executive entrenchment. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Roger W. Ferguson Jr. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote for re-election. Roger Ferguson Jr., who joined Alphabet's board in 2023, is the former CEO of TIAA and a former vice chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve. A seasoned executive with deep expertise in economics, finance, and regulation, he is a strong independent director candidate for Alphabet due to his background in regulatory policy and risk management. At a time when Alphabet faces antitrust scrutiny and complex global regulatory issues, Ferguson's insight is invaluable. He can help the board navigate discussions with regulators and ensure compliance and ethical standards in areas like fintech, privacy, and artificial intelligence from a policy perspective. Ferguson also enhances the board's diversity. He is an African American and brings a perspective from the outside of Silicon Valley echo chamber. He has no ties to Alphabet's founders or management, ensuring an impartial viewpoint. Since joining, he likely serves on key committees like audit or governance and can bolster the board's oversight rigor. Shareholders should vote for Ferguson's re-election as he represents the kind of director that can help lower the regulatory evasion measure by encouraging proactive compliance and transparent dealings. Furthermore, as a proponent of stakeholder capitalism, Ferguson has spoken about corporate responsibility in prior roles. He may support measures that align with Alphabet's practices with long-term shareholder interests and societal expectations. Keeping Ferguson on the board is aligned with shareholders' goal of a credible, expert, and independent board. Next director of the board on the docket for re-election today is Shriram. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote against re-election. Shriram is an original investor and has been on the board since Google's founding era in 1998. Like Doerr, Shriram's tenure exceeds 2 decades, and he is a close associate of Larry Page. They met at Stanford, making him effectively an insider. Shriram has benefited from Google's multi-class structure and has shown no inclination to advocate for changes that would dilute insider control. He also does not bring unique skills that are irreplaceable at this stage. Initially, his Silicon Valley connections and mentorship were invaluable, but now Alphabet's needs have evolved. Additionally, Shriram has been selling Alphabet stock in recent years. From disclosure, so he has sold shares worth millions, which is his right, but it means he's monetizing his stake while retaining voting control via any remaining Class B shares, a dynamic that frustrates other shareholders. Given his extremely long tenure and aligned voting with the founders on all issues, a vote to withhold support or vote against Shriram is justified to promote board independence. This is consistent with institutional shareholder services guidelines that often recommend against directors who have excessive tenure or insular affiliations. Removing or signaling disapproval of Shriram can open the door for a new director with fresh expertise. For example, someone with AI ethics experience or a consumer perspective. It also sends a message that shareholders want an end to the, quote, old guard, unquote, dominance on the board. In summary, while appreciative of Mr. Shriram's early contributions, shareholders should conclude that his continued presence impedes modernization of Alphabet's governance, and thus a vote against his re-election is warranted. Next director of the board on the docket for re-election today is Robin L. Washington. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote for re-election. Robin Washington, appointed to Alphabet's board in 2019, is the former chief financial officer of Gilead Sciences and a respected finance executive. She chairs the audit committee, as is typical for a former CFO, or is at least a key member of it, ensuring strong financial oversight. Ms. Washington is independent and relatively new, meaning she's not entrenched. She brings significant expertise in financial reporting, compliance, and corporate strategy from the biotech pharma industry, which is valuable for Alphabet's board diversity of thought. Furthermore, as an African American woman, she contributes to the board's demographic diversity and fulfills investors' expectations that the board should reflect a range of experiences. Washington has likely been supportive of improvements in reporting transparency given her background, and possibly open to more ESG considerations. Gilead, her former company, had to balance profit and social impact too. There have been no controversies or performance issues associated with her directorship. By all accounts, she has been an asset. Therefore, a vote for Robin Washington is recommended. She embodies the type of qualified, independent director shareholders want to keep. She strengthens financial governance, provides a fresh perspective relative to the founders, and can mentor newer directors in oversight duties. Retaining her will help ensure continuity in robust audit and risk practices, which is especially critical as Alphabet deals with complex financial commitments, for example, massive artificial intelligence infrastructure investments and potential legal contingencies like fines or resettlements. Her re-election deserves support as part of building a credible and accountable board. In conclusion, by following the aforementioned voting recommendations, shareholders can collectively signal which direction they want Alphabet's governance to evolve. Supporting independent, newer directors, Arnold, Chávez, Ferguson, Washington, and keeping Pichai for management insight, while withholding votes from entrenched or insider directors, Page, Brin, Hennessy, Doerr, Shriram, will send a strong message with votes against. Although the voting outcome is foregone due to insider control, the proportions of votes against or withholds of support will be closely watched. Even a significant minority of against votes can press the board to make changes. As seen in other controlled companies where founder control eventually yielded to shareholder pressure over time, the goal is to push Alphabet's board toward better balance, oversight, and responsiveness, ultimately lowering the company's Proxyopoly TM score from its extremely high status and aligning it more with shareholder interests and public expectations for a company of its scale. Sources for this exclusive Proxyopoly TM research report include the analysis supported by Alphabet's recent proxy statements, independent research from governance experts, news reports on the 2023 to 2025 shareholder meetings, and commentary from investor advocacy organizations. Key sources include official voting results and proposals from Alphabet's 2025 AGM, investigative reports on Alphabet's dual-class share impact, and recommendations from proxy advisory firms regarding board elections, among others, as cited throughout the report. That being all the time we have in this Proxyopoly TM episode, Proxyopoly TM presents the final disclaimer. The Proxyopoly TM score and accompanying analysis are purely hypothetical for entertainment and educational purposes only. Any resemblance to real-world events is purely coincidental, though with Alphabet Inc.'s current governance trajectory, reality may be catching up faster than we expect. And as always, Proxyopolis, if it ain't Proxyopoly, you're Proxyopolying.